Metabolism refers to the chemical reactions taking place in the cell. Now these different metabolic reactions or chemical reactions are arranged into metabolic pathways, so they happen in kind of a chain or a sequence of steps. So these chemical reactions they occur in steps for a few reasons. So when we talk about something like cell respiration, we know what our substrates are, we know we have glucose, we know we have oxygen, and we know that our products are water and carbon dioxide. But this is kind of an overall summary of what we start with and what we end up with. Along the way, there are lots of little regulated steps. Now the reasons for this is because if we regulate this reaction along the way in small steps, energy is released in small amounts. And this is so that it can be adequately harnessed by ATP. If we had all the energy released in one big hit, it would be an overload, it would be too much. Whereas if we can regulate energy to be released in small amounts, in small steps along a metabolic pathway, then we're able to get appropriate amounts released at times along the way, which the ATP can then harness to be resynthesized, so reattach that phosphate group to ADP. Also, temperature is going to be maintained in the cell a lot more easily if we have this regulated pathway where small amounts of heat are released along the way. So in a metabolic pathway, as different compounds are created from previous compounds, we get this release of energy from the bonds, and some of that is going to be heat, wasted heat energy. So if we ensure that this happens in a regulated manner, small amounts of heat are released along the way, we don't get this big boost of heat energy which is going to cause the cell to rise in temperature too greatly. These pathways also allow the cell to have some control. So we have along the way the production of what are called intermediate compounds. So as one compound is turning into the next, which is then reacting and turning into the next before we get our eventual products, it means that the cell can speed up or slow down this reaction along the way by ensuring that there are more or less enzymes perhaps present which are able to make the next step occur. We'll talk about that more shortly. And finally, like I just said, these pathways will produce intermediate compounds which the cell may actually have use for. So it's good that we produce some of these intermediate compounds along the way before we get to our endpoint, because the cell might actually be able to put these to use and they might actually be required. Let's draw out a very simple metabolic pathway here. We'll look at the different kind of factors that come into play. So let's say we start out with initial compound. Have compound 1. And compound 1 is going to turn into compound 3, but not before it turns into compound 2 along the way. So we have this extra step here to ensure that energy and heat are going to be released gradually in smaller amounts along the way, and we don't get this big hit, and the cell is going to have more control, and the cell might even have use for compound 2 inside. So when compound 1 becomes compound 2, what's going to happen is we're going to get this release of energy. So some of that is going to be able to be harvested or harnessed by ATP, and some of that is going to be waste. So some of that energy is not going to be harnessed by ATP, it's just going to be waste heat energy in the cell. Now, in order for compound 1 to become compound 2, we we need enzyme A to have an effect on this process. So enzyme A is going to help compound 1 break down into compound 2. Now when compound 2 becomes compound 3, we have a similar situation. We're going to get this energy release. Some will be harnessed by ATP, some will be waste. Now, we also, in order to see enzyme 2 become enzyme 3, compound 2 become compound 3, we need an enzyme. But this enzyme must be specific to this particular step. Enzyme A won't cut it here. We might need enzyme B. So enzyme B will be a different enzyme which will be suited to being a catalyst for this particular breakdown or this particular stage in the metabolic pathway. So only enzyme A will be able to catalyze compound 1 become compound 2. Only enzyme B will be able to catalyze compound 2 becoming compound 3. So it's a really important thing to note is that enzymes here are going to be specific to different steps, different stages along the metabolic pathway. Now, as always seems to be the case, there can be problems which arise with this kind of scenario, this kind of setup. And one of the big issues is going to be disease or genetic disease, which can cause problems in these metabolic pathways and give rise to issues inside of a particular organism. So let's say, for example, someone has a genetic disease where they have difficulty producing enzyme B. So let's just say that someone struggles to produce enzyme B. Now what we can see here is that compound 1 is still going to be able to become compound 2 because enzyme A functions correctly and it can turn compound 1 into compound 2. But when compound 2 needs to become compound 3, if someone has a genetic disorder or disease which doesn't allow them to produce enzyme B, then that means that compound 2 will not be able to become compound 3. So this person might have issues releasing the maximum amount of energy from compound 1 because they are missing this step as they don't have the required enzyme being created. So overall, metabolic pathways are chemical reactions that happen in small amounts of steps. Each step is usually catalyzed by a particular enzyme. And the reason why cells have chemical reactions take place in this way is in order to release small amounts of energy appropriate to be harnessed by ATP, so they can control temperature, they can control the reaction and regulate the reaction along the way, and they can make use of intermediate compounds over the course of the pathway.